Yes.
So we looked on Monday at the annual returns up to and including 1985. I'm not going to go to any of the later annual returns, but I'm going to look next at some documents on a similar theme, exploring what products were used in what volume, and whether there was any discernible policy in terms of the use of products. If we start with TREL 5059_008, please. This, in fact, is a letter about the use of cryoprecipitate, May 1973, from a consultant pathologist in Warwickshire to Dr. Arenston, and about an individual pupil. But it's interesting to note, if we pick it up halfway down that paragraph, one point which interests me is that the amount of cryoprecipitate which I administered is rather less than that given by yourselves. I found out that with the admittedly relatively bleeds, which he has had here, a total of 8 units given over 2 days seems to control the hemorrhage adequately. If you feel that it would be better to give larger doses, however, I will bring my treatment into line with yours. And again, that's an early indication of a theme which emerges from some of the documents about the volume of product used in treating pupils at the school. In terms of when concentrates were first introduced, if we look at DHSC 013025_098, this is an early reference, a relatively early reference to the use of concentrates. It's a letter from Dr. Rainsford to Dr. Maycock, 18th of March 1969, and it refers in the first paragraph, many thanks for your letter and for the 6 bottles of dried concentrate. I certainly feel safer now that we have something in return for emergency purposes. And then the letter continues with some information about supplies to Treloar's. He says so Dr. Rainsford says in the second paragraph, the needs of the college for AHG now are no heavier than they would have been before I came here had the boys been adequately treated. I have no information concerning any estimates having been made for AHG before I ever came here. Furthermore, it's only now that any accurate figures are available upon which any estimate could be based. So it appears to be Dr. Rainsford's view that there had been under-treatment prior to his arrival at the college or school. And then he says that he had discussed the supply of both cryoglobulin and fresh frozen plasma with Zeitlin, and that's a reference to doctor at the South London Transfusion Service. I think we'll see a reply in a little while. And at that time, Zeitlin informed me that his output of cryoglobulin could not exceed more than 100 bags a week. He did, however, agree to supply me with 15 bottles of fresh frozen plasma and 24 bags of cryo twice weekly. He has, however, not always been able to maintain this. I now find that the bottles of fresh frozen plasma we received from Zeitlin only contain approximately 300 millilitres, and I had assumed they would contain 450 millilitres. Each case needing treatment requires on average 900 millilitres of fresh frozen plasma or 9 bags of cryo. Our records over a period of 6 months show that we have on average 3 cases to treat a day. You'll realise, therefore, how very short we are of these materials, and we often have nothing in reserve should an emergency arise except what you supply by way of dried concentrate. Personally, I feel 100 bags of cryo a week is a ridiculously small output for the whole region, especially so when it's remembered that one case requiring open surgery could mop up the whole of it. So that gives some insight into Dr. Rainsford's approach as at 1969. In terms then of evidence from individual witnesses who attended the school, there are witnesses who recall receiving fresh frozen plasma in the late 60s at Treloar's, and then starting to receive cryoprecipitate, 69, 70, 71. And then there is evidence of pupils receiving concentrates as treatment from about 1972 predominantly. We'll look at some of the studies when we come on to research later in the week, but there is references to pupils receiving prophylactic trials of factor VIII in around 1973. And then, as we saw from the annual returns, as we go through the 1970s, the use of factor concentrates increases substantially. If we can then look, please, at HHFT 40916_003. This is at the end of towards the end of the 1970s now, and it's an exchange of correspondence between Dr. Krask and Dr. Arenstam that we've looked at previously, but not in the context necessarily of focusing on what it means for Treloar's. So 10th of May 1979, Dr. Krask wrote to Dr. Arenstam in the terms we see set out here, in the second. Well, I'll pick it up actually in the first paragraph. You'll be aware that the study of NHS factor 8 has now been going for almost a year. I've not so far been notified of any cases of hepatitis in patients treated with the designated batches used in this study. Perhaps you could also let me know whether in actual fact you've had any cases after these batches. I suggest that for the second year of the study, some of this material should be used to treat mild haemophiliacs coming up for non-urgent operations such as tooth extraction. We found from observations at Oxford this is the best way of finding out whether the material is associated with cases of hepatitis, as most patients treated under these circumstances will be susceptible to non-A, non-B viruses in the transfused material. I'm aware that you may prefer to use commercial concentrate for some patients in this class, but it would provide valuable information if you could use some of the material issued in the way I have suggested. And then we have the handwritten entry at the bottom. I realise that the above suggestion does not apply to the LMT boys. And then we've looked, again, previously at Dr. Arenstam's response, but if we can look at it again, HHFT 40916_002. This is Dr. Arenstam's letter to Dr. Krask of the 14th of May 1979. We have not had any cases of hepatitis following NHS factor 8. As far as your suggestion about transfusing mild haemophiliacs with this material is concerned, I totally disagree with this concept. I do not wish any of my mild haemophiliacs to develop hepatitis in any form, and therefore adopt the policy of either using DDAVP or cryoprecipitate. Now, pausing there, it needs to be borne in mind, of course, that Dr. Arenstam was responsible not just for the treatment of the pupils at Treloar's, but for the treatment of the population more generally in the local area. And the centre, whilst located at the school, was a haemophilia centre which treated people who were not pupils at the school. We're not aware of there being in any significant number, if in any number at all, pupils who were mild haemophiliacs.
It would be counterintuitive to think they would be there.
It would.
Because there would be no reason for them not to be in mainstream education.
Precisely. And perhaps implausible to think that there would be many local education authorities willing to fund a placement at a boarding school for someone with mild haemophilia. And certainly, not just from the oral evidence we've heard, but in terms of the records that the inquiry has examined, they have related invariably to patients with severe haemophilia.
So this response is not Dr. Arenstam taking a stand on behalf of his boys, but on behalf of his adult mild haemophiliac patients.
Well, that would certainly seem to be the logical deduction, sir, yes.
Yes.
So with regard then to the students at the school with severe haemophilia, there does not appear to have been any specific policy in place in terms of how to treat them. We've seen from the annual returns very significant volumes of factor concentrate used and a range of different commercial concentrates as well as NHS concentrate as well. And there doesn't appear to be anything, certainly not in any of the documentation we've seen, which suggests any particular type of policy of reserving one particular type of concentrate for one particular type of pupil, or limiting pupils' exposure to concentrates, or limiting pupils' exposure to multiple batches. On the contrary, the evidence appears to suggest very much the opposite in relation to that. If we look at then again, in terms of just trying to get some understanding of Dr. Arenstam's approach to treatment, IPSN 40331_008. This is a file note of a meeting dated the 31st of August 1978. The meeting is said to have taken place on the 25th of August 1978. It's a meeting between, I think, the director of Spaywood or a representative of Spaywood and Dr. Arenstam. And it says in the first paragraph, Tony Arenstam, one-time haematologist at LMT, returned from a spell in New York last summer as director in charge of the whole unit and also the haematology/pathology facility at Basingstoke. All orders for the Wessex area are processed through the buying office in Winchester, but Arenstam makes the decisions as he is by far the biggest user. His first requirement is convenience of administration, since they can often have 15 infusions to give at a time. The 6-month study of all commercial concentrates last year showed haemophilin factor 8 to be better than CoA in this respect. In his opinion, solubility is slower with our product. It is worth going back if we can provide evidence to the contrary. And then in the next paragraph, there is a discussion about Dr. Arenstam's methods of treatment of patients with inhibitors and a reference to including Hi8 in their considerations. A reference in the next paragraph to Dr. Arenstam being interested in the PE material, I think that's the polyelectrolyte material, and he believes animal, presumably that's a reference to the porcine product, has a place in treatment but has never used it. And then, perhaps so that we don't need to go back to this document, we can just pick up a couple of other themes. It says he mentioned Ritzer's theory for the treatment of inhibitors by giving frequent low doses of human factor 8. This is said to reduce the inhibitor level. I referred to the hepatitis problem with armour material, but this was discounted. Arenstam believes hepatitis is strictly a function of the number of doses given and said that 48 of his present patients at LMT have had it and it frequently recurs. And again, obviously, I'll come back to issues about hepatitis at a later stage. So that is a report, and obviously it's second-hand, but a report saying that Dr. Arenstam's first requirement was convenience of administration and an express preference for haemophilin factor 8. And then if we go to the witness statement of Dr. Painter, which is WITN 5277001. And Dr. Painter, you'll recall, was a clinical medical officer within the Hampshire Area Health Authority and working at Treloar's for a period between 1977 and 1978. And if we go to paragraph 17, I think it is, I'll just find the page reference. It's top of page 9, please, Shomik. So he was asked about how decisions were taken about what products to use for individual patients. And he said this: apart from pupils who've been enrolled in the hepatitis study, started before I took up post, I don't know how decisions were made as to which products someone should receive. I imagine it was dictated to a certain extent by what material was available at Treloar's at any given time. When it came to the concentrates, haemophil was the preferred option because it went into solution more quickly than the others, especially the Lister product, which could take up to 20 minutes or more to dissolve, if I recall correctly. And so you may think that's consistent with what we saw in the Spaywood note of a recollection that convenience of administration was a factor at least. The evidence that we've heard this week, the evidence we've heard previously from Treloar's pupils, and the annual returns all indicate that individual pupils were given a variety of products. And we can just look at a handful of further documents by way of example. If we start with TREL 40328_077, please. We see here, April 1979, a letter from Dr. Swinburne to a doctor in Scarborough, and it refers to the patient having come to see Dr. Swinburne and that she'd studied his treatment records from Lord Mayor Treloar. And then we can see the reference in the second paragraph. I note that he received a variety of products at school, sometimes 3 different products within 2 or 3 days. If we go to TREL 5056_014, this is, again, this is a different pupil. This is in relation to the mid-1970s, and we can see there cryobulin, different batch of cryobulin, and then Lister, 2 different batches, and then a further 2 different batches of cryobulin, and so on. And if we just look a little further down the page, yes, so we can see over a period of a number of weeks a range.
And yet, if we look at the bottom of the page, where it skipped. Can we just go up? Keep it there, please, Shimmick. At 27,575, there is part of the cryobulin is the batch 09M6974, and then that appears to be still available on the 1st of July when it's given then.
Absolutely.
So it's part used, part reused.
Yes. Yes, and there appears to be no obvious design in terms of trying to adhere to or limit exposure to multiple batches, multiple donors, and different types of concentrate.
Well, quite the reverse.
Yes.
And it may fit with one of the reasons I asked the question I did of Lee's Day was that it appears that all concentrates were treated in exactly the same way when it came to how much you needed. So you could pick and mix.
Yes. And if we go to WITN 1592011, this, I think, is a document that we looked at when Richard Warwick gave his evidence in 2019, but we can see it's a letter from Dr. Arenstam to Dr. Swinburne dated 23rd of April 1979, and we can see in the first paragraph, it says, "Thank you for sending me a copy of the letter you wrote to Dr. Whitehead, in which you state that you think it would be wise for us to stick to one product and suggesting haemophil. Since Richard has been with us, he's received a total of 208 transfusions. The material he has received is broken down as follows." And then we can see cryobulin 80, Lister 73, factor 8 24, haemophil 16, coate 15. And then the view that's expressed in the final paragraph says, however, his ability to take over 200 transfusions of concentrate without any reaction suggests that there is not really a problem here. And in view of the difficulties we experience in supplying replacement material for 55 severe haemophiliacs, I would prefer not to confine Richard to a single concentrate. So again, there an express rejection of a proposal being made to confine exposure to a single concentrate, and saying don't want to do that, and referring again to questions of what might be regarded as convenience in terms of having 55 patients to treat.
Yeah.
And again, I won't put every document on screen, but we've got multiple witness statements from either those who were at Treloar's or those who are the relatives of individuals who attended Treloar's, which tell the same story. So we have, for example, a statement, well, actually, I will put it up, WITN 1353001. And we can go to page 2. This is a statement from a widow talking about her late husband, Charlie, and in paragraph 8, she says, from September 79 to July 1980, Charlie attended the Lord Mayor Treloar College, where he was treated with haemophil, factor VIII, coate lister, and cryobilin. So that there, within a single school year, we see reference to 5 different types of concentrate being used. And then if we go to WITN 1202001, WITN 1202001. If you haven't got it, don't worry, I can read it. If we go to the 3rd page, and we can just see, if we look at paragraph 14, it refers again to attendance at Treloar's. This shows that I was receiving various brands of factor VIII products from as early as May 1974, when I received haemophil. Whilst at Treloar, and this is someone who left in 1978, I was also treated with Lister concentrate, cryobilin, coate, and factor VIII. So the recollection of individual witnesses is entirely consistent with the inferences that you might wish to consider drawing from the annual return data that we looked at. And then we saw yesterday during John...
The total number being treated for severe haemophilia was very little different from the total number in quite a number of other centres we've looked at, is it not?
That's absolutely right. It might be thought of as a middle-sized centre, perhaps.
Admittedly, they may have been rather less moderate and mild.
Yes.
But none of those other centres appear to have had any particular difficulty in maintaining one commercial product, sometimes 2 for the sake of making sure they didn't run out of supply, throughout the whole period, did they?
Well, it's a mixed picture, but that's certainly true of some centres. There are other centres where, again, there appear to be multiple different products being used. Of course, what's significant, or perhaps of particular significance here to bear in mind, is that we're dealing with the treatment of children.
Yes. But the question is one of whether this was effectively chosen, one inference being for convenience, or whether it was forced upon the centre because they couldn't get enough products and so had to pick and mix themselves. But given the way in which the products were used interchangeably almost for individuals, despite obviously having the product in stock, it's difficult to draw that conclusion, I think.
Yes, I mean, we'll look in a few minutes at some documents which show Dr. Arenstam raising concerns about insufficient supplies of NHS concentrate. Whether he was unable to obtain a sufficient supply of a single concentrate, there's no particular evidence to show that he was, but the documentation doesn't address that one way or another. But if one assumes, as it were, that perhaps that was the situation, and he had to buy a range of different commercial concentrates, or the centre had to purchase a range of different commercial concentrates, what one then doesn't see is any attempt to say, well, I've got enough cryobilin to treat 12 patients of my 55. Those 12 will only get cryobilin. The next 12 will only get haemophil. The next 12, other than when it comes to certain pieces of research and study, and we'll look at that later in the week, then it does appear to have been possible, at least for periods of time, for the purposes of study and research, to maintain pupils on a particular concentrate. But other than that, it simply doesn't appear that there was any attempt to do so at any stage.
And if there was a problem with commercial supply, you'd expect to see that in the Winchester purchase orders.
Yes, or expected to see something which articulated that as a particular difficulty.
And if it applied to Hampshire, Winchester, then you'd expect it to be evidence of that sort of problem affecting other parts of the country.
Yes. And although there are, from time to time, shortages of particular products that we see over the years, again, there isn't anything, given the whole stretch of period that we're looking at in relation to Treloar's, that would suggest that's an explanation for the approach that was adopted here.
But at the moment, it looks as though the probable conclusion from this, again, subject, of course, to what anyone wishes to submit to me, is that this was a choice made, for whatever reason, by the administration at Treloar's, at the centre.
Yes. And then, and we can take that down, thank you, Chairman. As we heard yesterday during the evidence of John Peach, you'll recall the letter we looked at from Oxford inviting Treloar's to continue to use NHS concentrates to reflect the fact that that's what Lee had been treated with at Oxford. And then we saw what in fact happened was treatment with multiple concentrates and multiple commercial concentrates. On a similar theme, there's another example of that. If we look at TREL 40175_090, so this is another letter from Dr. Ritzer, 21st of November 1978. It's about different pupils. Thank you for your letter of the 10th of November about the above boys who are interested in learning self-therapy. I've not seen any of those boys for some time now. Providing you think they've grown to be sensible and responsible individuals, I see no reason why they should not go ahead to administer treatment themselves. On looking through our records, I see that none of the boys has hepatitis B antibody and that they've all been treated mainly with NHS factor 8, although, and then one is identified, has had the occasional dose of armour. I think, if possible, they should receive treatment with the NHS material. So a similar request to the request that we looked at yesterday in relation to Lee Peach. If we then look at TREL 5036_004, this is a document which it refers to relates to one of the pupils who was the subject of Dr. Ritzer's letter. And although we can see on the first page the treatment is with the Lister material, and likewise on the second page, if we look down the bottom of the second page, we start to see use of haemophil. And then if we go to the next page, what we see is haemophil and then factor 8. And that continues over the page. It's then predominantly haemophil. And then if we go to the next page, these are not in date order. So we see coate and haemophil. If we go to page 7, we can see a range of different products. This is all the same pupil: haemophil, cryobulin, coate, Lister. If we go on to page 9, haemophil and factor 8. In fact, I think before that letter from Dr. Ritzer had been written in relation to this pupil, in any event, the pupil had already been given commercial concentrates. But certainly that pattern then continued, and there doesn't appear to have been any attempt to accede to Dr. Ritzer's suggestion of adhering to NHS concentrate. And then moving on from the question of using a range of different concentrates to the question of how much concentrate overall was used, if we can pick matters up in Dr. Arenstam's thesis, TREL 40517, if we can turn to page 106. We can see bottom of the page, Dr. Arenstam says, during the years of the study, the amount of therapeutic material used, and this is at Treloar's, rose by a factor of 2.5 from 561,640 units of factor VIII in 1973 to 1,153,340 in 1977. And then there's reference to the table showing the average weight of haemophiliacs and so on. The annual usage of factor VIII, this is 4 lines from the bottom of what we see on the screen, per bleed has risen from 879 in 1973 to 1,045 in 1977, a factor of 1.2. And then he refers to this increase being sustained in the years 77 to 75. And if we look at the next page, the table, or the first of the tables that was referred to in the text, is the table we see here, which shows numbers of patients and then units of factor VIII there set out, and we can see the increase over the years. So an approximate doubling between 1973, not a doubling, sorry, an increase between 1973 and 1977 in terms of the number of patients from 39 to 51, and then proportionately a rather greater increase in terms of units of factor VIII.
Yes, it's roughly at 77, there's 1 1/3 times as many patients. It's getting on for 3 times, not quite the amount of factor VIII. So the individual amounts given has shot up.
Yes. Now, it's right to note, if we go to page 112 in this document, Dr. Arenstam says in the second paragraph that over the 5 years of the survey, the number of bleeding episodes more than doubled. And then he says treatment policy remained the same, the presumption being, therefore, that the haemophiliacs entering the college towards the end of the period were more severely affected. And at the end of that paragraph, he says the college is probably now seeing only the worst cases which cannot be managed at home. If we look at the next page, there's a description of Dr. Arenstam's, or the college's, policy. This is specifically now looking at particular types of bleed. If we pick things up, we can see the second line there, from 15 to 17 years, the elbow was the commonest site and so on. And so he's talking about bleeds into the arm and says this, however, caused the increase of bleeding into the arm in severely affected adolescent haemophiliacs between the ages 10 and 17 should warrant special measures to manage and, where possible, to prevent these bleeds. In response to these findings, present policy at the college in treating elbow bleeds in pre or early adolescence is to, and then we can see, treat these bleeds vigorously. So that's the articulation of policy, and then pay scrupulous attention to restoration of function, limited prophylaxis when recurrent bleeds occur, and then a programme of physical treatment. That gives, again, some insight into what Dr. Arenstam's approach may have been, one of wanting to treat bleeds vigorously. If we look at the bottom of the page, he identifies the marked increase in the use of therapeutic material at the centre between 1973 and 77, and then says a large part of this can be accounted for by the increased bleeding frequency of pupils at the college. So that's the point made on the previous page. It's obviously right to point that out. And if we go over the page, and we pick it up at the top of the page, second line, he says an increase in the number of transfusions rather than the amount of factor VIII per transfusion therefore accounts for some of the increased usage of factor VIII. If we go back to, in this same document, to page 86, so this is in an earlier part of Dr. Arenstam's thesis, and he says this picking it up in the second paragraph, as preparations of factor 8 became more freely available, so reports of undesirable side effects became more and more frequent, culminating in the realisation that widespread parenchymal liver disease appeared to be a direct consequence of transfusion therapy. Many other immediate and delayed hazards have been described. While no really convincing evidence has been presented to link the majority of undesirable side effects to the quantity of factor VIII transfused, it is logical to look for the lowest dose of factor VIII likely to be clinically effective. So that appears to be an articulation of looking at lower dosage, but that doesn't appear to be borne out by what we see elsewhere, either in terms of the approach to individual patients or the overall policy, which is referred to in other documents as well, of vigorous treatment and prophylactic treatment.
Yeah, can you remind me of the phrase which he used? I think it's in the file note of the meeting with Spaywood, which would be what, IPSN, something or other, when he said he believed that hepatitis was strictly a function of, and I can't remember the last few words.
Yes, it's IPSN 40331_008. What he says there, bottom of the page, is hepatitis is strictly a function of the number of doses given.
The number of doses. So his actual view there is, we go back to where we've just been looking at 517_086. It's 4 zeros, 517_086.
Yeah, but there's no underscore, it's just page 86, Shimon.
So if one puts the two together, he has the view that the number of transfusions creates a risk. The amount of each transfusion doesn't necessarily, but logically it might. That's how they reconcile, presumably.
Probably, yes.
I mean, otherwise they're saying different things.
Yes. And then I'll be coming back to Dr. Aronstam's thesis in the course of the week, but again on similar themes about the way the centre treated its pupils. If we go to CBLA 3023, so CBLA 0003023. This is a letter from Dr. Stafford, the Devon Area Health Authority, Plymouth Health District, to Dr. Maycock, at 21st of March 1978. And again, it just provides a snapshot which may illuminate the approach at Treloar. So it's a patient who has returned to the care of Plymouth after leaving Lord Mayor Treloar what's said to be last year, so presumably 1977. And what Dr. Stafford says to Dr. Maycock is this: with this in mind, would you please help us? Perhaps I might sketch the problem. Treloar had a large research grant and were able to give the boy 740 units of haemophil every alternate day. As the end of his school days approached, they told him that this form of prophylaxis would cease when he left school. And when he came to us on his penultimate holiday, we had quite a time trying to reassure him that we would cover him. We had no choice then to continue the haemophil, since our supplies of Elstree preparations were and are restricted. After some careful negotiating, we cut his, on a reference to the parents in the Haemophilia Society, we cut his dose by half and carried him through the latter part of last year, with a view to switching to Elstree products as soon as our reserve stocks allowed us to use 4 bottles per week. This we can now just manage. And so it says in the next paragraph, we've achieved this switch, but the patient still fails to have confidence in our surveillance. And then it says we cannot fail to have in mind the financial aspects of this contretemps. Treloar were running at over £20,000 annually at the current price. We were obliged, even with half that, to ask for a specific grant from the local DMT to cover this boy's therapy. And he refers at the end of the letter to having written to Dr. Arenstam to enter a mild protest at our predicament. But that is an indication, as I say, by way of snapshot of two very different approaches to treatment. Large amount of treatment by way of haemophil, so commercial concentrate every alternate day on a prophylactic basis at Treloar's, and then a much lesser volume given once the patient has returned to the home area. And then if we can see a letter from Dr. Arenstam himself at TREL 5072_029. (18th of May 1979) to Professor Ingram at St Thomas's. This is about a different pupil. We can see in the second paragraph, Dr. Arenstam says, traditionally at Treloar's we've used a 20% rise for simple uncomplicated hemoarthroses and a 30% rise for complicated hemoarthroses and muscle bleeds. He says in the last sentence of that paragraph, we've also noted in a recent survey, which is awaiting publication, that muscle bleeds on the whole require more transfusions per bleed than joint bleeds. And then this, I'm aware that there are many publications around at the moment extolling the virtues of lower doses of factor VIII. All I can say is that I've yet to see anything that could be called hard data, and the results must be cast as anecdotal. And then he goes on to refer to his own double-blind controlled trial of 3 different doses in the management of hemoarthroses involving the major joints. And again, I may come back to that when we look at research later in the week. And then he says, further down that paragraph, an interim analysis at this stage of about 100 elbow bleeds has shown convincing evidence that treating elbows with the lower dose results in delayed return of full mobility. I also think that there's accumulating evidence that the low dose is inefficient in many other situations. And then he says it's apparent that when the elbow is a target joint, the low dose is even more harmful. And then if we pick it up in the last but one paragraph, as far as the prophylaxis dose is concerned, our own studies have shown that a 30% dose for prophylaxis is more efficient than the lower dose. When using prophylaxis to protect a particular joint, I think that a higher dose is always justified. Finally, I should point out that the adolescents in my charge come to me at a time of greatly changing stress on their joints. I believe that I am the custodian of these joints during their time with me, and if I can send them from the college with their joints intact, then I believe I've done some part of what I should. Because of this responsibility, I think it would be wrong for me to use unproven dosage schemes for any length of time. So again, that may provide some insight into Dr. Arenstam's particular approach to treating bleeds.
Is there any indication anywhere in how he selected those pupils at Treloar's who would get the lesser treatment, which he thought would be not fulfilling his responsibilities?
I'm not sure whether there is or not, sir. Can I check? And I'm going to come on to a number of the studies, including this one, later in the week.
Well, we'll look at it
see
then,
if we have
perhaps.
that information or not. And then if we look, and then this goes back to the question of overall usage of factor VIII. If we look at HHFT 301073, this is a report in, I think, 1986 from the Treloar Haemophilia Centre to the region. I'm going to come back to a lot of this report at a later stage when we look more specifically at the question of the response to AIDS. But if we go to page 6, and we look at the bottom half of the page, under the heading Treatment of Bleeding, Dr. Arenstam says this: the annual use of factor VIII, which peaked in 1984, has decreased by 1/3 since then, although the number of bleeding episodes treated has not altered significantly. Table 1 also shows very little change in the total number of transfusions given, and that the number of transfusions per bleed is largely changed. We have, however, significantly reduced the average amount of factor VIII given per transfusion. So this is post-1984, is what he's saying. They have reduced the average amount of factor VIII given. And then he says this is due to a combination of factors. Firstly, our intensive regimes in the early 1980s have improved joint and muscle states, and bleeding episodes are less severe and less frequent, thus requiring less factor VIII. We've also studied the responses to treatment over the years and have learnt the minimum doses which are needed in different situations. Can I then move to a slightly different topic, which is just to look at, first of all, mechanics of supply, and then to look at concerns raised by Treloar about shortages of supply. So in terms of mechanics of supply, we looked earlier this afternoon at that letter in 1969 from Dr. Rainsford to Dr. Maycock, thanking him for a provision of an early and emergency supply of freeze-dried concentrates. And he referred in that letter to concerns about the limited supply of cryoprecipitate he'd been receiving. If we just look at a letter from the Dr. Zeitlin referred to in Rainsford's letter, it's at DHSC 013025_100. And you'll see it's a letter of the 20th of March 1969, National Blood Transfusion Service, South London Transfusion Centre. So Dr. Zeitlin is the director at the South London Transfusion Centre in Sutton, and he's writing to Dr. Maycock. Rainsford sent me a copy of his letter to you of March 18th. When I met him in September of last year, we agreed on the figures which he quotes, and these have been maintained with perhaps 2 exceptions when the St Thomas's demands were exceptionally heavy. More recently, Rainsford seems to have reassessed his position and was asking for the equivalent of 10,000 cryos a year. This, together with our other quite heavy commitments, is quite out of the question. And one wonders what happened to the Treloar cases before he took over. And then the next paragraph. Finally, Rainsford feels that 100 bags of cryo a week is a ridiculous output for the whole region. In point of fact, the whole region of Essex is not producing any, he says. So that's the perspective of the transfusion centre at that stage supplying Treloar's with its cryoprecipitate. If we go on a few years to 1974, OXUH 40652 this is a letter from Dr. Arenstam to the Department of Health and Social Security, to Dr. Waiter there. And we can see from this that the source of supply now of cryoprecipitate is now the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre, so no longer looking to receive products, it would seem, from South London. It says, Dear Dr. Waiter, the Treloar Haemophilia Centre is based at the Lord Mayor Treloar College at Alton and services the needs of 50 severely affected haemophiliac boys who reside at the Lord Mayor Treloar College. In addition, the centre is responsible for the needs of all other haemophiliacs in its catchment area, which is the whole of the North Hampshire Health District. During 1973, this centre used 900,000 units of factor VIII in the treatment of haemophilia. We used approximately 650,000 units of factor VIII as cryoprecipitate, 50,000 units as fresh frozen plasma, and about 200,000 units as human and animal concentrate. So this gives us a snapshot of the picture before we have the annual returns available from 1976. Our official supply from the Wessex Regional Transfusion Centre at Southampton is the equivalent of 10,000 bags of cryoprecipitate, or 182 bags per week throughout the year. I've been repeatedly told by Dr. Smith that this is the absolute maximum production he is able to make available for me. The excess material we have used is the equivalent of another 77 bags of cryoprecipitate a week, or 5,000 units of concentrate per week. I have had to obtain these extra materials from a variety of sources, often at very short notice, and a great difficulty to both myself and the sources. I've had to beg for materials from other transfusion centres. from the Lister Institute, from the Oxford unit, from the Bristol and Edgware transfusion centres, and from other haemophilia centres who've supplied me with material unofficially. I have also had to, when all else has failed, buy off the commercial market and have spent about £1,000 in the past year. This situation is quite impossible. We are never able to plan ahead, and there is always the danger that our sources, entirely unofficial, will dry up, leaving our large pool of haemophiliac boys without any reserved therapeutic materials for emergencies. At a recent symposium attended by, amongst others, Doctors Rosemary Biggs and Catherine Dormandy, it was agreed that the sort of work we are doing should be supported, and there should somehow be available adequate therapeutic materials for this purpose. And then, top of the next page, I've calculated that on the commercial market, our shortfall of factor 8 would cost £26,000 annually. I feel it's imperative that our supplies are guaranteed, especially as we are looking after boys from all over the country and may therefore quite reasonably be regarded as providing a national service. I should like to appeal to you to make the necessary funds available so that until a guaranteed supply can be made available from within the health service, we are able to buy all our needs on the commercial market. So you will see that's Dr. Arenstam's stance as at 1974, clearly wanting to maintain what he regarded as the necessary supply for the treatment of the pupils at Treloar's and indeed for the treatment of the haemophiliacs in the wider catchment area. So we can see at that point in time it would appear that Dr. Arenstam was able to make his own purchases of commercial products, but his request was for enhanced funding. If we look then at OXUH 303765_020, we can see that these are the minutes of haemophilia centre directors and blood transfusion directors within the Oxford haemophilia super-region, 19th of June 1978, and the second attendee down is identified as being Dr. Arenstam. And there's a discussion now in 1978 about the issue relating to supply at page 4. So we can see the heading halfway down the page, supply of therapeutic materials. And then if we look at the next paragraph down, Dr. Arenstam said that he was encountering problems because of the change of policy over ordering commercial factor 8. Initially, he had ordered the commercial factor 8 on prescription directly from the commercial firms, but now he had to get it via his regional blood transfusion centre and budget ahead for how much he would need. He did not think that he would be able to manage within his budget. And then Dr. Smith, who I think was the director of the Wessex Transfusion Centre, said that he did not think that there was any problem in the Wessex region apart from the one at Alton, which was a special case because of a large number of haemophilic boys at the college. He was awaiting the DHSS's reply to a request for official recognition of the special situation at Alton. And then if we skip down 2 paragraphs, it then says the question was raised as to whether or not Alton should send a bill to the other regions for the factor 8 used by boys at the college. This was discussed but thought difficult as the NHS did not like to do cross-accounting and it would prove very difficult to organise this for Alton in isolation. There was a strong feeling amongst the directors that the DHSS be reminded of the continuing shortage of NHS freeze-dried factor 8 and of the continuing need to buy commercial factor 8. So that's the discussion in 1978. And then if we just go back into slightly earlier in the 1970s, there's a letter from Dr. Arenstam, PRSC 302515. This is looking at shortages on a national scale and what he viewed as under-treatment, effectively, or insufficient treatment being, therefore, possible on a national scale, and not simply looking at the position of Lord Mayor Treloar College, although he refers to it in his letter. So it's a letter from Dr. Arenstam. Sorry. It's a letter from Dr. Biggs. My apologies. To the Lancet, June 29th, 1974, about the national picture. And then if we pick up the reference bottom half of the page to Treloar's. We can see it's about 10 lines up from the bottom. It says, even with dire economies, some centres have been hard-pressed to maintain minimum treatment. For example, the treatment of the boys at the Lord Mayor Treloar College at Alton in recent years has been maintained against a background of begging and borrowing from other centres from one week to the next. Were the school not supplemented in this way, it's calculated that there would be a deficit of about 260,000 factor 8 units annually. So it's contrary to what one might think is the picture that emerges from other documents, including the returns, which appears to show very substantial volumes of concentrates being used. The perspective of Dr. Arenstam, apparently shared by Dr. Biggs and perhaps some of the other directors, does appear to be that there is insufficient for Treloar's to perhaps treat pupils as much as it would like. And then the letter from Dr. Biggs continues with an overall expression of concern about what's said to be insufficiency of NHS product and therefore the need to supplement that by reference to the purchase of commercial products. If we then go to DHSC 01405_159, this is a table. Sorry, go to the second page. This again looks at the picture in the early part of the 1970s. So it's anti-haemophilic factor issues 1970 to 74, principal users. And we can see it gives a pattern of usage from 1970 through to the first half of 1974, and figures for a number of centres. And we can just pick up the picture in relation to Treloar at the bottom of the table. So we can see the figure there given 38, then 34, 66. And then by 1973, 497, and then the 504 for January to June is not to be doubled, but is representative of what's said to be extrapolating likely to be the annual usage for that year. So again, for that period when we don't have the annual returns, it appears to show a significant increase in terms of product usage in that first part of the 1970s. And if we just go back to the whole table, we can see, for example, Treloar's comparing very similarly to the Royal Free in terms of what's anticipated for 1974. Royal Free, a much larger centre, albeit I don't think we have figures for the number of severe haemophiliacs at that point in time at the Royal Free. But significantly more, by way of example, than, or some more than it seems to be anticipated for use at large centres such as Manchester Royal Infirmary. And then there's another letter. Sorry, I'll find it in a moment. At CBLA 40219, this appears to be an example of what was described as the begging and borrowing. So this is a July 74 letter from Dr. Arenstam to Dr. Maycock. Thank you for your letter offering to provide 5 bottles of this material per week. As you know, this is not the answer, but it's certainly a help, and I would be very grateful for this to be instituted as soon as possible. May I take it that I can still try to obtain more as dire needs arise? If we look, however, at CBLA 40745, we get a slightly different picture here. So this is March 78, Dr. Arenstam to Dr. Stafford. again, it's in the context of an individual patient, but it's the wider points being made by Dr. Aronstam that are of interest. Picking it up in the second sentence of the second paragraph, you may be interested to hear that we now use prophylaxis routinely in many clinical situations. We feel it can be a positive benefit when some of our boys are going through difficult patches. We are obviously more fortunate than you in that the Wessex region is supplying us with all the material we need for our admittedly enthusiastic programme. The climate with regard to prophylaxis appears to be changing, and I do hope the wind of change blows your way fairly soon. So, as well as putting perhaps a slightly different complexion, at least by 1978, on the concerns expressed earlier in the 70s on the issue of supply, it may reflect the possibility that it's the enthusiastic programme, to use Dr. Aronstam's own term, and the use of prophylaxis, which may be leading to Dr. Aronstam or the centre more broadly at various stages saying we don't have enough, we need more. If we then look at a letter the following year, again, it perhaps gives yet a different perspective. It's HHFT 301062. Here we have Dr. Aronstam writing on the 19th of November 1979 to the regional medical officer in Winchester, expressing difficulties in terms of getting sufficient resources. So it says, following our conversation last week, I've been looking into ways of conserving resources. I've explored several avenues with mixed success. I've attempted to switch to the cheaper brands of commercial concentrate, but have been frustrated because the transfusion services bought its stocks up to the end of the financial year, and no amount of switching on my part will save any money. I've approached my biggest supplier of concentrate and asked them to cut their price. They've responded by offering a certain amount of free material over the next few months, but for the reasons mentioned above, this again will not save any actual hard cash. I've asked BTS to supply me with more NHS cryoprecipitate, which would save money on commercial concentrate, but is much less convenient for us to use. However, I've been frustrated in this too because of a regional directive to send more plasma to the Lister Institute to make NHS concentrate, and there is therefore less available for locally produced cryoprecipitate. This double squeeze is perhaps not appreciated by yourself, but the two aims of A, using more cryoprecipitate, and B, sending more plasma to the Lister Institute are not compatible. 4, and then this refers back to the double-blind controlled trial. We've recently completed a double-blind controlled trial in the treatment of hemoarthrosis, and I'm able from this work halve the dose of factor 8 which we are giving for ankle bleeds. In the long term, this should result in substantial savings, and he refers to a paper. And then I have, in addition, enjoined the college academic staff to institute more severe discipline in the hope that spontaneous bleeds may be reduced in frequency. This goes very much against my views on the management of haemophilia, and I'm bitterly disappointed having to resort to these measures. In response to my appeal, the headmaster is sending out the enclosed letter to all parents, and obviously I can ask the headmaster about that tomorrow. Finally, the only other option left is to undertreat the boys. This I am in no circumstances prepared to do, and if all else fails and your mention of curtailing on admission to the college would still come about, I would like you to put in writing the possible options and how you feel I can still save money if all the above measures fail. Again, provides some insight into Dr. Aronstam's thinking at the end of the 1970s, although perhaps not very easy to reconcile with his March 78 letter talking about being able to get all the material they need for their admittedly enthusiastic programme. So I note the time. We started late, but I'm conscious I've been going for an hour and 5 minutes, and I'm proposing to do a little more today, but it may be that others would benefit from a break.
Yes, well, we'll take a break in that case till 4 o'clock.